We like to believe that good deeds are rewarded, but the universe doesn't operate on morality. It operates on physics. Today, we will analyze 6 stories of people who made the right choice and received a death sentence from reality. This is a study of consequence, not a how-to guide. Never place yourself in a danger you aren't prepared for. On the morning of May 18, 1980, the silence hanging over the Cascade Range in Washington state was a deception calculated by geological time, a quiet pause before the planet reminded humanity of its violent authority. At an observation post codenamed Coldwater 2, parked on a high ridge exactly 6 miles north of Mount St. Helens, a 30-year-old volcanologist named David Johnston sat alone in a small camper trailer, surrounded by a forest that was about to be erased from history. The air was crisp, the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue, and the coffee in his cup was likely the only source of warmth in the chill of the early dawn. Johnston was not a tourist or a thrill seeker. He was the sentry standing guard at the gates of a planetary monster. For weeks, the mountain had been exhibiting terrifying symptoms of a terminal diagnosis, swelling outward at a rate of 5 feet per day, a phenomenon scientists called a cryptodome. Johnston, a man of precise intellect and profound dedication, understood the mechanics of the threat better than anyone else on the team, having famously remarked to reporters that the mountain was a keg of dynamite with the fuse lit. While the rest of the world saw a majestic peak, Johnston saw a pressurized bomb waiting for a trigger. Yet he had volunteered to take the shift, replacing a colleague to ensure the data stream remained uninterrupted. He was the human variable in a grand experiment of nature, monitoring tilt meters and seismographs that measured the heartbeat of the Earth. He knew the risks were not theoretical. He had fought hard to keep the local government from reopening the area to the public, arguing that the exclusion zone was the only thing standing between tourists and total annihilation. At 8:32 a.m., the data stopped being theoretical. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath the north flank of the volcano, destabilizing the massive bulge that Johnston had been watching with such intensity. In a matter of seconds, the entire north face of the mountain, billions of tons of rock and ice, detached and began to slide downward, creating the largest landslide in recorded human history. This was the variable that no computer model had fully predicted. The landslide uncorked the pressurized magma chamber like a shaken bottle of champagne, but instead of erupting upward into the sky, the blast fired sideways. It was a lateral blast, a supersonic shotgun discharge of superheated gas and pulverized rock aiming directly at Johnston's ridge. The safety buffer zone, calculated to be safe from a vertical eruption, was meaningless against a lateral detonation moving at the speed of sound. In this split second, where the mind processes information faster than reality can unfold, Johnston did not run for the safety of his vehicle because he knew the math. The blast was traveling at over 600 miles per hour, faster than any car could drive, faster than any human could run. He did not dive for cover because there was no cover that could withstand the energy of 24 megatons of thermal force. Instead of panicking, he reached for his radio. He knew that thousands of people in the valleys below and the command center in Vancouver, Washington, had zero visibility of the collapse. He was the only eyes on the target. With the horizon turning into a wall of approaching death, he keyed the microphone and shouted the final words of his life. "Vancouver! Vancouver! This is it!" It was not a scream of terror, but a professional declaration of fact. He spent his final seconds of existence executing his duty, converting his own inevitable demise into a warning signal for others. The mechanics of consequence arrived moments later. The lateral blast, reaching temperatures of 600 degrees Fahrenheit, hit the ridge with a force that stripped the forest down to the bedrock. The camper, the truck, and the observation equipment were not merely destroyed, they were mechanically scrubbed from the surface of the Earth, atomized by a stone wind that carried the force of a nuclear detonation. Johnston's death was likely instantaneous, the result of catastrophic trauma and thermal shock that occurred faster than the human nervous system could register pain. The blast wave overtook the sound of the eruption itself. He likely saw the wall of gray death arrive in total silence before the roar could reach him. In the residual echo of the aftermath, when rescue teams eventually reached the site, there was nothing to recover. The lush forest was gone, replaced by a moonscape of gray ash and flattened timber. The ridge where he stood, now officially named Johnston Ridge, remains a silent monument to the moment human courage intersected with the indifferent violence of geology. His transmission gave authorities a critical head start to lock down the airspace and mobilize emergency responses for the surrounding towns, validating the warning systems he had helped build. David Johnston did not die because he was careless. He died because he refused to abandon his post until the data was delivered, proving that even in the face of absolute annihilation, the human instinct to protect can override the biological instinct to survive. On the freezing morning of December 6, 1917, the harbor of Halifax, Nova Scotia, was a bustling theater of war logistics, a place where the machinery of commerce met the grim reality of conflict. But for Vincent Coleman, it was just another Thursday of managing the chaotic schedule of the Canadian government railways. Coleman was a 45-year-old train dispatcher, a man defined by the precise logic of timetables and the rhythmic clatter of the telegraph key, sitting inside the Richmond station just yards from the freezing water's edge. He was a veteran of the rails, a family man who understood that in the world of heavy locomotives, a difference of seconds could mean the difference between efficiency and catastrophe. Outside his frosted window, the harbor was waking up, but something was terribly wrong in the Narrows, the tight strait connecting the Bedford Basin to the open ocean. Two massive ships, the Norwegian vessel SS Imo and the French freighter SS Mont Blanc, had performed a clumsy, grinding dance of steel that resulted in a low-speed collision. To the casual observer on the docks, it looked like a standard maritime accident, a minor spectacle of smoke and fire that drew crowds to the windows to watch the drama unfold. But the reality was hidden in the cargo manifest of the French ship, a document that Coleman likely knew by heart or learned in a moment of terrified clarity when a sailor sprinted past his window. The Mont Blanc was not a normal freighter. It was a floating arsenal, packed hull to deck with the most volatile explosives known to man. It carried 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and 35 tons of benzol stacked in drums on the deck. It was, in every technical sense, a nuclear bomb designed before the nuclear age, waiting for a thermal trigger. The collision had breached the benzol drums, leaking fuel that ignited instantly, turning the deck into a blast furnace that was heating the picric acid below. When a sailor from the burning ship ran past the station shouting that the vessel was drifting toward Pier 6 and was going to explode, the timeline of Coleman's life split into two distinct paths. His first instinct, the biological imperative driven by millions of years of evolution, was to run. He grabbed his coat. He stood up. He actually began to move toward the door, stepping out onto the platform to join the fleeing crowds. He knew the geography of the station. He knew that the burning ship was drifting closer by the second, and that staying meant certain death. But as he reached the threshold of safety, the cold logic of his profession overtook the heat of his fear. He remembered the overnight express, train number 10 from St. John, New Brunswick. It was carrying 300 passengers, soldiers, civilians, and families returning home. And it was currently hurtling down the tracks at full speed, scheduled to pass directly between the burning ship and the station in less than 4 minutes. If Coleman continued to run, he would survive, but the train would enter the blast zone, and hundreds of people would be erased from existence. If he returned to his desk, he could stop them, but he would not leave the room alive. In a display of courage that defies the basic laws of self-preservation, Coleman turned his back on the open door and returned to his telegraph key. He sat down, his hands trembling not from cold, but from adrenaline, and began to tap out a message in Morse code, the copper contacts of the key clicking like a frantic heartbeat against the silence of the impending doom. He sent the warning up the line to the station in Truro. "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." He did not just send it once. He kept the line open, repeating the signal, ensuring that the message propagated through the network, locking the train's brakes miles away from the kill zone. At 9:04 a.m., the chemical reaction inside the Mont Blanc reached its critical threshold. The ship detonated with a force equivalent to 2.9 kilotons of TNT, creating a blast wave that moved faster than the speed of sound. The explosion didn't just destroy the Richmond station, it vaporized it. The temperature at the epicenter briefly exceeded 5,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun, followed by a pressure wave that flattened structures for miles and snapped heavy trees like matchsticks. Vincent Coleman experienced an instantaneous death, a clinical end that arrived before his brain could even register the flash of light. But his message had traveled faster than the shockwave. Train No. in 10 screeched to a halt a safe distance away in the woods of Rockingham, the passengers jolted by the sudden stop and the distant roar, unaware that they owed their lives to the empty chair in a vanished station. The explosion remains the largest non-nuclear man-made blast in history, claiming nearly 2,000 lives and blinding countless others with shattered glass. Yet the death toll was hundreds lower than it should have been. Coleman's final act was not a battle against an enemy, but a race against time and physics. A race he won by sacrificing his own future to secure the future of strangers. His telegraph key fell silent, but the echo of his discipline resonated through the lives of every passenger on Train No. 10, proving that, in the face of inevitable destruction, the human will can still dictate the terms of the finale. On the frozen afternoon of January 13, 1982, the capital of the United States was not the seat of political power, but a prisoner of meteorology held captive by a blizzard so severe it had paralyzed the logic of a modern city. At National Airport, Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737 carrying 79 souls, sat on the tarmac accumulating a deadly layer of ice on its wings, a subtle aerodynamic defect that would soon prove catastrophic. The crew, anxious to return to Florida, made the fatal decision to take off without proper de-icing, gambling against the immutable laws of lift and drag. The gamble failed in less than 30 seconds. As the aircraft fought for altitude, the physics of flight abandoned it. The plane stalled, pitched up, and slammed into the 14th Street Bridge, crushing 7 occupied vehicles before plunging nose first into the Potomac River. The impact was a violent collision of aluminum, concrete, and freezing water that instantly silenced the lives of 74 people. However, in the chaotic aftermath, amidst the stench of jet fuel and the grinding of ice floes, a statistical anomaly occurred. 6 people surfaced from the wreckage. They were battered, suffering from blunt force trauma and shock, clinging to the jagged remains of the tail section in water that was a deadly 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Among them was a 46-year-old bank examiner named Arlen D. Williams, Jr. He was not a soldier, a first responder, or a trained rescuer. He was a man in a business suit, trapped in a scenario where the average human survival time was less than 20 minutes. The water of the Potomac was not merely cold, it was a thermal vampire, a heat sink that conducted warmth away from the human body 25 times faster than air, shutting down the metabolic furnaces of the survivors with terrifying speed. As the survivors huddled together in the blinding snow, a United States Park Police helicopter, piloted by Donald Usher and Gene Windsor, arrived on the scene, performing dangerous low-altitude maneuvers to drop a lifeline to the victims. This is where the logic of self-preservation, the most basic instinct encoded in human DNA over millions of years, was overridden by a conscious, fatal choice. When the lifeline, a simple ring on a rope, landed directly in Arlen Williams's hands, the path to survival was open. He was alert. He was capable of grabbing the ring and being lifted to safety. Instead, he looked at the flight attendant next to him, Kelly Duncan, and passed the line to her. The helicopter lifted her away. Williams remained in the freezing water. The helicopter returned, the rotor wash kicking up a blinding spray of ice water. Again, the line went to Williams. Again, he caught it, and again, he passed it to another survivor who was too weak or injured to fight for it. He did this not once, but 5 separate times. With every pass, he was calculating a fatal equation. He was trading his own remaining thermal energy for the lives of strangers. The physiology of his heroism was brutal. Every time he moved his arms to catch the rope and hand it off, he forced warm blood to flow from his core to his extremities. accelerating the heat loss from his vital organs. He was literally spending his life force as a currency to buy time for the others. The crowd watching from the bridge and the millions watching on live television saw a man repeatedly refusing salvation, but they could not see the biological clock ticking down inside his chest. The cold was causing functional paralysis, a condition where the nerve impulses can no longer trigger muscle contraction. By the time the helicopter returned for the sixth and final trip, the mechanics of consequence had finished their work. Arlen Williams was no longer holding on to the tail section. His muscles, deprived of oxygen and warmth, had ceased to function. The buoyancy of his winter coat was no longer enough to counteract the weight of the water-soaked clothing and the pull of the river. When the pilot looked down for the man who had orchestrated the entire rescue, he saw only an empty patch of black water filled with jagged ice. Arlen Williams had slipped beneath the surface, succumbing to drowning and hypothermia just moments before he could be saved. He was the only person that day who survived the violent impact of the crash, but died in the water, solely because he prioritized the evacuation of others over his own exit. His body was recovered later, and the cause of death was officially confirmed as drowning. The bridge he crashed into was later renamed the Arlen D. Williams Jr. Memorial Bridge, a permanent structure of steel and concrete named after a man who proved that the strongest force in nature that day was not the ice nor the cold, but the human will to save a life at the cost of one's own. On October 19, 2004, in the murky, industrial waters of a reservoir in Redwood City, California, the sun was just a distant memory, irrelevant to the two men working in the cold darkness below. Robert Bob Howard, a seasoned commercial diver with years of experience in the high-stakes world of underwater construction, was navigating a hostile environment where the atmosphere is liquid and the pressure is a constant physical weight. He was not a recreational swimmer exploring a reef. He was an underwater industrial worker encased in a heavy helmet and a dry suit, breathing compressed air supplied by a surface umbilical, surrounded by the hum of pumps and the grinding of silt. His task, along with his 23-year-old colleague, was routine maintenance on a subsurface water transmission pipe, a massive artery of civil infrastructure designed to move millions of gallons of water. However, in the world of hydraulics, routine is a dangerous illusion. Lurking in the physics of this pipe was a phenomenon known to every professional diver as delta P, or differential pressure. It is the silent killer of the deep, a force that occurs when two bodies of water have different pressure levels and a pathway opens between them. When a valve is cracked or a hole exists, the water from the high-pressure side rushes to the low-pressure side, not as a stream, but as a violent, invisible hammer, creating a suction force that can exceed thousands of pounds per square inch. While the two men worked, this invisible equation solved itself in a split second. Howard's younger colleague moved too close to an intake pipe where the flow had not been fully isolated. Instantly, the differential pressure grabbed him. It was not a gentle pull, it was a hydraulic clamp, pinning the diver against the grate with a force that no human muscle could overpower. The younger man was trapped, his air supply threatened, his body pinned against the steel by the relentless weight of the water column above him. Robert Howard watched this happen. He was a veteran. He understood the math. He knew that the suction force holding his partner was overwhelming and that getting close to the kill zone meant inviting the same physics to destroy him. In this moment, the biological imperative to survive screamed for him to retreat, to surface, to signal the tender above. But the professional imperative, the code of the diver, overrode the instinct. Howard moved into the danger zone. He did not swim away, he swam toward the suction. He knew that pulling his friend from behind was useless against the hydraulic force, so he maneuvered himself to pry the younger man loose, using his own body as a lever to break the seal. It was a contest between human strength and the weight of a reservoir. For a few agonizing seconds, Howard fought the flow, and miraculously, he won. He managed to dislodge his colleague, breaking the suction seal just enough for the younger man to scramble free into the neutral water. But the laws of physics demand a balance. The moment the younger diver was released, the void he left behind was exposed again, and the water demanded something to fill it. The Delta P instantly reasserted its dominance, and because Howard was the nearest object, the suction transferred directly to him. The invisible hand that had held his friend now slammed Howard against the pipe. The force was catastrophic and immediate. This was not a slow drowning, it was a violent collision with the infrastructure he was trying to repair. The pressure differential pinned him with such intensity that his equipment was compromised, and his body was subjected to fatal compressive trauma. The younger diver, now free and terrified, watched as his savior was claimed by the very trap he had just escaped. Rescue attempts were made, but the physics of Delta P are unforgiving. Once the seal is made, it often requires shutting down the entire system to equalize the pressure, a process that takes far too long for a human lifespan. Robert Howard was recovered only after the flow was stopped, his body still held against the worksite by the relentless water. He died of traumatic asphyxia and compression injuries, a clinical end to a heroic act. He did not die because of an error he made. He died because he successfully completed the most dangerous trade in the world, a life for a life. In the silent, cold mathematics of the reservoir, Robert Howard balanced the equation with his own existence, proving that while water always seeks the path of least resistance, a brave man will choose the path of greatest resistance to save a brother. On a scorching afternoon in 2013, the sun-drenched asphalt of a busy Australian highway was vibrating with the heavy, hypnotic rhythm of commerce, a chaotic environment where fragile human bodies and high-speed steel machinery were separated only by painted lines and luck. Marco Devastic, a 27-year-old man with his entire life ahead of him, found himself standing on the edge of this concrete river, not for his own benefit, but for the sake of a stranger. He had noticed an elderly woman attempting to navigate the treacherous crossing of a multi-lane road, her pace slowed by age and the overwhelming sensory noise of the rushing traffic. In a society that often hurries past the vulnerable, Marco made the conscious, fatal decision to stop. He stepped out onto the road, offering his arm and his guidance, acting as a human shield to create a safe passage for someone who could no longer move with the speed of youth. As they made their slow, deliberate way across the tarmac, the world around them seemed stable, but a few hundred meters away, a mechanical catastrophe was reaching its breaking point. A heavy transport truck was thundering down the highway, its wheels spinning at hundreds of revolutions per minute. Deep inside the hub assembly of one of its rear tires, a silent, invisible failure was occurring. Whether it was due to long-term metal fatigue, improper torque application during the last maintenance cycle, or a microscopic fracture in the lug bolts, the result was a sudden and violent surrender of physics. The fastening mechanism failed. Under the immense centrifugal force generated by the highway speed, a massive dual-wheel assembly, a dense projectile of steel and reinforced rubber weighing significantly over 50 kilograms, sheared off the axle. This was not a tire simply rolling away. It was a kinetic missile. When a truck wheel detaches at speed, it retains the forward velocity of the vehicle, often exceeding 80 kilometers per hour, and it possesses a terrifying gyroscopic stability that keeps it upright and bouncing with unpredictable, lethal energy. The wheel became an unguided weapon, skipping across the pavement with the momentum of a cannonball, closing the distance to the crosswalk in a matter of seconds. The sound of the separation was likely a sharp metallic crack, followed by a dull rhythmic roar, a noise that cut through the traffic din like a gunshot. Marco heard it. He looked up and saw the black mass hurtling toward them, bouncing erratically off the uneven road surface. In that fraction of a second, the phenomenon of time dilation took hold of his perception. He calculated the vectors instantly. The wheel was too wide, too fast, and moving too erratically to simply step aside. The elderly woman, with her limited mobility and slower reaction time, had zero statistical probability of evading the impact on her own. If Marco jumped clear, which his young muscles were perfectly capable of doing, the laws of ballistics dictated that the wheel would strike her directly, and at her age, the impact would be an absolute death sentence. He was the only variable that could alter the equation. Instead of diving for the safety of the verge, Marco anchored his feet and used his remaining second of existence to shove the woman violently out of the kill zone. It was a forceful, desperate push, the kind that bruises but saves. As she stumbled into safety, Marco's body remained in the path of the projectile to ensure the trajectory was clear. The physics of the collision were brutal and instantaneous. The heavy wheel, carrying thousands of joules of kinetic energy, struck him with the force of a high-speed vehicle crash, concentrated into a small surface area. The impact was not merely a collision, it was a transfer of energy that the human frame is simply not designed to withstand. Marco took the full, blunt force trauma to his chest and head, acting as a biological brake for the runaway mass. He collapsed on the road, his internal systems overwhelmed by the catastrophic shock of the blow. When the dust settled and the traffic screeched to a halt, the silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The elderly woman was shaken, bruised, and terrified, but she was alive, breathing, and safe, standing just feet away from where the wheel had finally come to rest. Marco Devastic, however, did not rise. He had died on the asphalt, succumbing to fatal internal injuries before help could even arrive. The tragedy of his death is amplified by the sheer randomness of the mechanical failure. He was not a soldier in a war or a fireman in a blaze, but a young man doing a simple kindness on a Tuesday afternoon. Yet in that final, freezing moment, he proved that heroism is not about the scale of the stage, but the clarity of the choice. He traded his future for hers, standing his ground against the blind, unfeeling inertia of a 50-kilogram machine part, ensuring that while he would not walk away, the stranger under his protection would live to see another day. On the morning of November 21st, 1980, the ground beneath a construction site in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, was a ticking clock, but only one man on the crew truly understood the physics of its countdown. The work was routine, laying a new sewer line in a deep trench, a standard procedure in a world built on hidden infrastructure. Eugene Gino Motilla, a 28-year-old construction veteran, stood on the edge of that trench, supervising the work of his 19-year-old colleague, Perry Mignogne, who was working 12 feet below the surface. The day was cold, the air crisp, and the job was just another item on a Friday schedule, a mundane reality that masked the latent danger lurking in the soil. The trench walls were cut almost perfectly vertical, a common but dangerous shortcut that defied the natural angle at which Earth prefers to rest. This soil wasn't stable bedrock. It was a heavy, unpredictable mix of clay and loose fill, held together by little more than temporary friction. Without warning, that friction gave out. A massive section of the trench wall, weighing thousands of pounds, silently detached and slumped into the hole. It was not a loud, dramatic explosion, but a heavy, suffocating surrender to gravity that buried young Perry Mignogne instantly, encasing him in a tomb of cold, heavy earth. He was gone, swallowed by the ground he stood on, vanishing from sight in less than 2 seconds. In the stunned silence that followed the thud of the collapse, Gino Motilla faced a binary choice that defines the absolute limit of human courage. He knew the golden rule of trench safety, a rule drilled into every excavator and pipe layer. Never, ever enter an unprotected trench after a collapse. The initial slide is just the prelude. It destabilizes the surrounding earth, making a secondary collapse not just a risk, but a near mathematical certainty. The other workers on the surface shouted at him to stay back, to wait for the proper rescue equipment. Yet Gino did not listen. He saw the spot where Perry's head had disappeared, and he jumped. He leaped 12 feet down into the kill zone, landing on the shifting spoil pile that was effectively a loaded weapon. He fell to his knees and began to dig with a frantic, primal intensity, using his bare gloved hands to claw at the compacted dirt. He wasn't trying to free Perry's legs or body. He knew there wasn't time. He was digging for the face. He needed to find an airway before Perry suffocated under the weight of the soil. For agonizing seconds, the only sound was the rasp of his breathing and the tearing of the earth. His fingers found hair, then a forehead, then a nose. He cleared the dirt from Perry's mouth, allowing the teenager to gasp in a single, life-saving breath. Gino shouted, "I got you, buddy, I got you!" But the earth was not finished. The vibration of his landing, or the simple passage of time, triggered the secondary collapse that Gino knew was coming. A massive slab of the remaining wall, now completely unsupported, broke free. It was a wall of dirt weighing as much as a small car. In that final split second, Gino did not try to scramble out. He didn't curl into a ball to protect himself. He did the opposite. He threw his body over Perry's exposed head. He arched his back and braced his arms, creating a human tent, a desperate structural shield designed to take the full impact. The wall came down with a crushing finality. The weight of the soil struck Gino directly across the back and shoulders. The physics of the event were cruel. The sheer weight of the soil mass created an impossible pressure on Gino's body. He suffered fatal traumatic asphyxia, his ability to breathe mechanically halted by the sheer tonnage of the earth. However, underneath his lifeless body, in the small, triangular pocket of air created by his chest and arms, Perry Mignogna was alive. The dirt had buried them both, but the weight was resting on Gino, not on Perry's face. When rescue crews finally dug them out hours later, they found them in that frozen tableau, the older man shielding the younger, a final posture of protection that had turned a double fatality into a survival story. Gino Motilla had instinctively calculated the trade. He absorbed the kinetic energy and the static weight of the collapse so that the 19-year-old could breathe. He died not because he was trapped by accident, but because he chose to become the structural support that the trench lacked, proving that in the cold calculus of disaster, the human spirit is the only force capable of defying the crushing weight of reality. The final tally is grim: 6 deaths traded for dozens of saved lives. Now for the question no one wants to ask. Arlan Williams passed the rope 5 times. If the 5th person he saved was your father, and Arlan himself was the one who died, was the trade worth it? I want to see the real math in the comments. For more stories that challenge you, hit like and subscribe.